scribbled through my notes here this morning is that although the topics were so different and geographically and from different disciplines, I found that the leitmotif that Nina brought up this morning was repeated in variations by each one of the following speakers, and that is something that is hard to grasp. It has to do with interaction between people. It has to do with what Nina called sociabilities or commonalities between groups, and what Lacey spoke about when she spoke about the identity creating power of communities, of activism, and of creating communities that way, and what Worko also brought up as social interaction here. And I'm wondering, if we speak about migration studies, I mean, migration studies is not, if I understand it properly, a discipline in itself. But where do those experiential categories that we're speaking about here, beyond ethnicities, beyond racial questions, beyond politics, the way it is traditionally understood, where do they have a house? Where do they have a home? Or the other way around, what kinds of tools do disciplines develop to learn more, explore better into these experiential factors of commonalities and communities? That would be my question.
Right. Well, that's part of what I wanted to say. Let me see if there are further questions. People are leaving, and it's already lunchtime, so I think this is an ongoing discussion. I don't want to belabor this, but I just think that the question of time, place, and power run through these all the papers, and need to be emphasized more and drawn in, because there's always sociability, but the question is how we categorize the people who are interacting. You know, whether we see when we see draw lines of difference, when they draw lines of difference in the interaction, or what are the lines of commonality that can lead to social movements, and social movements for what? You know, is something we need to talk about that sometimes gets lost in migration studies, whatever the discipline. It's not just a question of studying daily life. It is a question of studying structure and agency put together. You know, we talked about structure, Min talked about structure, every paper talked about structure. We just heard about the changing structure of Ethiopian politics and economy regionally. Those things create and are created by people striving to make a world they can live in, you know, with this, in the conditions they find. And that can lead in different directions. So, I mean, so that for each of the papers, I had a question actually, like, what's going on now with the Chinese Americans who doing so well, the ones who are in not just doctors and lawyers, but finance capitalists, are the doctors and doctors finding themselves, their medicine attacked by the changing political economy, and are the finance capitalists finding more opportunities, and does that give them have different relations to the current situation? In other words, how is the current situation challenging us in terms of how we conceptualize migrants and their relationship to wherever they are living? The urban regeneration, I just want to say something about cities, because we were talking about cities. Urban regeneration is really interesting here, because on one hand, it creates disparities. On the other hand, cities have had a vested interest in welcoming migrants. Many cities, disempowered cities, and cities like New York or Los Angeles. And they're becoming advocates. That's why mayors are becoming advocates against the federal government for migrants. You know, they have a different view, and we need a way to theorize that and see when there's unity from people who are in the social movements for the dreamers or for people who, have been branded as illegal, and the mayors of the city. Why are they coming together? Why doesn't the mayor of New York City say, well, when people come to court, let's not give them criminal labels. Let's not call them criminals, because if they're called criminals, they're going to be deported. So let's think of something else to do. That's amazing, to rethink crime. Why would a mayor of New York City do that? What is the basis of that, and how does it link to these processes of displacement? What does New York City need to maintain its power, its powerful economy? Who does it need? Who does it need? And, and when we look at migrants as city makers, not just as identity makers, but as place makers, as part of the processes of both displacement and then rebuilding places, we see a more dynamic kind of a approach. I mean, that's very abstract in general. I think we want to go to lunch, but maybe we can continue throughout the day to think about what's happening now. Does our research allow us to approach that? Certainly, I also see, as Lacey said, there's emerging broader social movements coming out, and I see it as Trumpism as a social movement of the displaced, and these broader social movements for social justice. Yeah.
Jeanette, in her introductory comments, made a statement about migration being in the California DNA. Do we have research and studies that show that this state is particularly exceptional in terms of its vibrant economy based upon the migration of people of all cultures into this space?
That's a good question, and I'm not a scholar of California, but I think part of the problem is that question is rarely asked in various places. It has been asked in California, it has been asked in New York, but if we look more broadly, we see a range and a changing range of answers about the South right now, for example, and the fractures there. I mean, I see fractures among the huge support for the right wing of born-again Christians, because it's an immigrant, these are immigrant churches also, and I think that's a fracture. So in cities and in states, a lot of this contribution has been not looked at because we don't have the categories to look at it. Because we do look at local ethnic communities as if all immigrants live there, while immigrants are part of making the whole city, not just a local neighborhood. So we need to make a different kind of a lens that can look at those contributions, in all parts of not just U.S. society, but globally. It's not about the U.S. It's about what's happening around the world. And if we keep our lens just on our own nation state or on one nation state, then we're unable to really put our finger on the processes that are influencing us here, that we're part of.
I think not everyone's ready for lunch yet, because Kelechi, they want to say something.
I'll be very brief.
Yeah.
First, thank you so much for the presentation this morning, and thank you for that really focused analysis. Here is where I become a student again, because if we can go back to 1867 to see how Karl Marx talked about the dispossession, which was largely by force.
Yes.
And then we'll come to the 1940s and see how Karl Polanyi talks about the Holy Alliance that culminated in the Loja movement. And we can see how institutions deliberately created within the framework of the Bretton Woods structure has been able to persuade people that this is a way to engage in interaction at the state level, not minding the individuals, and the ways in which those institutions collapsed but were held up by the Richard Nixon's administration. they were held up, became the basis for structural adjustment. And therefore, now, soft power migration of Africans, especially those educated Africans, we begin to see how the end of those institutions are now leading to a different cycle of violence
Yes, yes,
on
yes.
migration. The case of Turkey.
Yes, yes. I mean, we have to put discussions of war and violence and its structural causes in this mix. I mean, and the differential power. I just want to say one more thing. Min and I never have a chance to talk, so Min, this is a funny way to talk, but it's also the rising power of China that influences the status, as you know, of Chinese Americans here. We have to have a transnational lens to see how that you know, global politics influences possibilities. You know, the way African nations are seen around the world influences what African migrants can or cannot do. You know, so we really need this lens. I call it a global perspective in order to talk about local things. It's not a macro level up here. It's a multi-scalar analysis that takes us right down to us standing here and connected to the world. Thanks.
Thank you.